Hello, today we're going to be reading Chapter 7 from Heart and Soul. Chapter 7 is titled Turn of the Century and the Great Migration. So, turn of the century is when it changes from like 1800s to 1900s or from 1900s to 2000. It's when the century turns, so a century is 100 years. And the Great Migration, you might think about migration with animals when you have large groups of animals moving from one place to another. But we're going to be talking about migration of people. And the quote for today says, "Freedom could make folks proud, but it didn't make them rich." And that's Felix Hayward, former slave. Okay? And here's our picture for today. The title is Migration, and so rightfully so. You have a picture of an African American family. Looks like they're getting ready for a road trip. The title says Southern Family Migrating North, about 1940. So 1940 would be 60, 80 years after slavery-ish. A little less than 80, actually, 65 to 1940, so 35 years. All right. So, the years after Reconstruction were some of the darkest since slavery. After we had made some progress, the rug was pulled out from under us, and control of the South ended up back in the hands of the same people who had always had it. We were expected to keep quiet, walk with our eyes downcast, and bow to white folks, being ever so careful not to cause trouble. It was a dangerous time for us. We were being kidnapped, lynched, shot, and burned all over the South. We had to stick together and watch out for each other like a big family. Millions of black folks were trapped in the South under the thumb of Jim Crow, and we might have stayed that way a lot longer if it weren't for all the trouble in Europe. So there's a couple things here. Remember we talked about Jim Crow were those laws that were made in the South that were basically unfair to African Americans, where they could go, what they could do, what they weren't and were allowed to do. And then they were being kidnapped, lynched, shot, and burned all over the South. That word lynched is basically if you take justice into your own hands. If you arrested somebody or somebody was arrested and instead of waiting for them to go to trial and see if they were guilty or not, you broke into the jail, pulled them out, and punished them yourself. That would be a lynching. A lot of times we think lynching means hanging somebody, but it's any act where you take justice into your own hands. So, it would have stayed that way if not for the trouble in Europe. So things are going on in Europe. Now, it's not particularly easy to describe what was happening in Europe at the time, but I can tell you that in 1914, Archduke Ferdinand, who was next in line to the throne of the Austro-Hungary Empire, was assassinated. In a very short time, countries all over Europe started choosing sides, lining up for war. Before we knew it, countries all around the world were pulled into their mess, ours included. War was coming. America needed to build weapons. There were plenty of factories up north at the time that were, There were plenty of factories up north that at that time were filled with European immigrant workers. Women and black folks were generally not welcome, but many more people were needed to build weapons for the coming war. So the factories are getting busy because of the war, and people that they wouldn't normally let work there, they're going to need them now. So you can see this picture. Let's see if I can get that in there. Again, sorry about the glare. Okay, you see them getting on the train, waving goodbye to loved ones. Okay. But as fighting began in Europe, America stopped letting most of the immigrants into the country. Ooh. So that's a lot of their workforce is immigrants. With so many new factories, there weren't enough immigrants to take the jobs. So as a last resort, the factory owners gave the jobs to women and black folks. Word about the new jobs spread like wildfire. The Chicago Defender, a black newspaper that was passed around in churches and barbershops, invited all to come north. On railroad trains, porters bragged about how well black folks were doing up north. Family members who had already gone there wrote letters saying that they earned several times more than what they had on the farm and that black folks could vote, go to schools, and fancy movie theaters and dress like movie stars. Ooh, sounds a lot better than it does down south, doesn't it? It all sounded pretty fine. Despite the trouble we had with white folks and the boll weevil beetle that was eating up all the cotton and destroying farmers' crops, most of us had grown to love the South and never seriously thought about leaving. The South was home, but like hundreds of thousands of black folks who weighed the trouble of living there against opportunities up north, we felt it was time to go. Now, leaving was easier said than done. White folks didn't exactly want us to go. After all, we worked the fields and paid their rents. If we all up and left, they would have been in a real fix. So they tried their best to stop us. They banned Northern black papers. Police officers harassed black folks at the train stations. Clerks ignored us when we tried to buy train tickets, and they even stopped the train service in some places altogether. But it didn't work, honey. No matter what they did, they couldn't stop us from leaving any more than they could stop the rain from falling. We had made up their minds. So they didn't treat them fairly, and they didn't like them, but they wanted them in the South to do all the work that they didn't want to do, all the low-paying jobs. So they tried to keep them from leaving, which is kind of strange when you think about it. My family went by train like most black folks, but some drove, rode on horseback or on a mule, or even walked. It took almost a full day to ride by train from Virginia to Chicago. We celebrated when we made it across the Mason-Dixon line and moved from the Jim Crow car to the cars where white folks sat. So the Jim Crow car, they had to be separated. So that's those Jim Crow laws. And when they got up north, those laws weren't in effect anymore, so they could move to different parts of the train. Some people even started praying and singing. The train was full of black folks on their way to Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit, or New York City. We learned that Southern black folks were pouring into neighborhoods like Harlem and the south side of Chicago, bringing Southern comforts like jazz and blues music and Southern cooking to big cities. That's another picture. It's factory worker, the flag in the background. The title of the picture says War Munitions Factory. So munitions is like weapons and whatever you need for war. And remember, that's why there were so many jobs up north, because there was a war going on, so they needed to make more stuff in the factories. When we moved north, we had to change our way of doing things. In the South, we were mostly dependent on the owner of the land for what we needed: food, shelter, schools, bad as they were, and work. Everything was purchased on credit, but up north, we had to find it all for ourselves. It made us much more independent. In many ways, life was better for us. Pap, Daddy, Mother, and all of the grown folks in my family found plenty of work, and we felt we had a bit more freedom. But we also learned that Jim Crow had made the trip right along with us. There was only one part of town where we could find a place to live, and the best jobs were closed to us. We didn't know that we had all walked right into the middle of what would be a huge fight. Owners of factories were making more money than they could count, while everyone else made pennies on the dollar, working long hours in unsafe factories, and it made a lot of people angry. So even though they moved up north, there were still forms of segregation up north as well. Not as bad as in the South, but there still were. Workers formed labor unions and organized strikes on the railroads, in mills, coal mines, shipping docks. Seemed like everybody was ready to strike, everybody but black folks. When we tried it, the factory owners just ignored us. Only the porters made any headway some years later. The owners fought dirty too, honey. When white folks picketed, the owners knew black workers weren't allowed into many of the unions, so they brought them into the factories to break the strike. It made for some real problems between black and white folks up north, and for very dangerous times. There were race riots and lynchings all over the north and south because of it. So when the workers weren't treated fairly, what they would do is they would strike. Now, strike means you refuse to go to work. And you see people with picket signs. They might be outside, and the sign would say what they're upset about. They're protesting. So what would happen is they would strike, and they would have a union. And basically, a union is where all the workers belong to this group, and it helps protect their rights and they talked to the owners and helped to work out differences between the owners and the workers. Well, they wouldn't allow black people into the unions, so they would try to get the black folks to come in and work in the factories when the rest of the workers were on strike. And obviously that would cause lots of problems because the workers on strike, the whole point was that the factory would close and lose money if the workers weren't there until the owners listened to them. But if you got people to go in and work in place of all those workers on strike, then the owners could still make money. So, and the black folks needed the jobs, so if you went in to work, you could end up causing a lot of problems. Like most black folks, Booker T. Washington, our most popular leader in the early 1900s, wanted equal treatment. He felt the best way to get it was for us to stop all the fussing and get to work. In the years after Reconstruction, he built Tuskegee Institute into a great school that taught black folks skills they could use to get ahead. Booker T thought we could gain respect by providing services to white folks and by showing that we could make our own money. White folks loved the idea, of course, but many black folks disagreed with him. The problem was bigger than money. Racism had been spoon-fed to generations of American children for hundreds of years, and it had convinced many black and white folks that white people were better than black in every way. The hatred it stirred between the two races took a life of its own. Americans badly needed to find a way to get past it. So it said spoon-fed racism. What that means is you spoon-feed a baby. So they're basically saying that people gave or convinced people to be racist. They gave them these ideas so that they felt this way. And when we talked a long time ago about how slave children and white children used to play together, and then as they got older, they had to be separated, and then they kind of taught the children how they weren't equal. It's kind of the same thing. Like, if everybody's kind of left to themselves, it wouldn't be so bad, but you kind of teach people that there's these differences, and it makes it worse. There's a picture here that we skipped over. It shows actually black workers who are striking. Okay. Unfair. Or protesting, I should say. Mid-City Realty unfair. Why pay rent when I can't finish reading this side. When your building needs repair. Oops. And then this picture here, this is Booker T. Washington. Okay. In any case, the fight for equality was put on hold when America entered the First World War in the middle of April 1917. Black men were eager to join the military, although very few black troops saw combat. Most black soldiers worked in labor battalions. The war ended about a year later in 1918. It's funny how things work out sometimes. War is a terrible thing, but strangely enough, this one did black folks some good. It had pulled over 1 million of us out of the South and helped us onto our feet.